All right. I think I would like to once again welcome you to the second session of our capacity building in understanding and applying social norms. So I'm so glad that a number of you who were in the first session have come back for the second one, and I urge you to also come back for the third and the fourth one, because I think they are really they're very essential and very useful in our work. So once again, you're welcome on behalf of the East African Learning Collaborative. Like I said last time, this is part of the activities of building up this East African network, and capacity building is part of it. But also as the network, that helps us build further the network and also explore ways of addressing the pivotal social norms that have really impacted on the progress, but also on the lives of so many people. And of course, this one also gives us an opportunity to meet again as a group, as a network, to get to know each other, but also in the process know what we are working on as we proceed in building our network. Rebecca and Meredith, thank you very much for coming, and our facilitator today, Rebecca, she's going to take us through assessing social norms to inform program design and implementation strategies, understanding and exploring and acting on findings. This is really super good for researchers, but also for programs, because many times we are working on these programs, but we really don't know what we are designing for and how to really capture those key social norms that really make a difference in our programming. So once again, everybody, welcome. Rebecca, welcome, and I hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grace. Thanks for those warm words of welcome. I have to sit from Meredith and my side. It's very early in California, so it's really nice to get online and see all of you here. So I'm just looking at the chat box. So welcome, Hawa, Mergisa. We have Brenda from Makerere, Anja and Ben and Alem, and Richard from Madipa, and hi, Becca from IRH. So we'll get started now, and I think you all know the Zoom drill by now. Please feel free to raise your hand at any moment if you have questions or you would like clarification. I think Meredith can help kind of monitor that for me as I'm talking with you. And if you would like to chat any questions, feel free to do that as well. We will have a couple of breakout sessions today when you'll have the opportunity to get into smaller groups with others. So today, as Grace mentioned, we're going to talk about assessing social norms. So figuring out what are the norms that might be relevant to the program that you're working with. We are going to start out with a quick update, or a review really, I should say, of where we are so far. This is our second session of our capacity building webinar. Many of you were in the last session, I hope, which Ben shared, and he talked about the relevance of social norms theory for health promotion interventions. So I'd be curious to know, those of you who can, if you go to where it's set, where under participants, and you have, I think it's under participants, if you can kind of just put a little green check or a reaction if you were here with us for the last session. While you do that, let me just give you the update. You'll have, after this session, our next one will be on identifying strategies for norm change, and the last session will be with Ben again. The last session will be with Betsy Kostenbader on monitoring and evaluation. So today we're going to do a recap, as I mentioned. We're going to do an introduction to norms assessments. We're going to talk a little bit in depth about one tool, the social norms exploration tool, and then we'll do a breakout activity. Okay, I see Grace and Jane are putting in the chat box that they were both with us last week. Okay, so starting with a recap. So you'll recall that we went over a working definition of social norms, that they are mostly unwritten rules of a group that group members follow because of what they think others do and what others approve and disapprove of. And that there's typically sanctions, positive and negative sanctions, that they are anticipating that helps them to comply or to encourages them to apply or not to apply. So social norms influence many different areas of outcomes. And I think we have on this call people working in across a number of these. So we typically use a lot of examples of child marriage because it's a really clear-cut example of social norms. We also talk about female genital cutting, but norms are also important for women's economic empowerment, family planning, and all of the other areas of behavior and health outcomes that you see here. So some of the key takeaways from our last session are here on this slide. So we talked about social norms being beliefs of two different types, and we often call them for shorthand, descriptive or injunctive. So descriptive is what one believes others do, and injunctive, what one believes others approve of. Then we have social norms that are different social norms across different groups. So you may be looking at one behavior such as family planning, and it might be in different groups, for example, men and women, or urban or rural groups, or older or younger men. They may have different norms that control or guide their behavior. So it's also, there's a number of norms and a number that sustain a practice. It's typically not just one practice and one norm. So when we're doing norms assessments and we're thinking about norms, it's important to think about a range of norms as well as those other drivers that influence the behavior. As implied there, social norms can be the main driver or sometimes not. So you might have a norm that interacts with others. So for example, my family planning example. So social norm, there may be a norm about family size, how many children a couple may have, but there also may be norms about couples talking about family planning, about men's authority over women, about mother-in-laws or other elders in the community and their influence on the couple and the number of children they have, or women's ability to move in the community freely. All of those norms influence family planning. So it's not just this main norm that might be the most obvious. And then we often talk about gender norms. So some norms are really specifically about what is a man's role, what is a woman's role, what are men's responsibilities, what are women's responsibilities, and those are typically structured according to patriarchal rules of women having less power and authority than men. And those are called gender norms, and often that's what we discuss in our groups. So I'm just taking a quick look at the chat box, so we have more people introducing themselves. Thanks everyone for that, and also seeing who we have, that we do have a lot of people who were in the session last week. Okay, so let me move on. So you might recall at the end of our session last week, we gave you some homework to do. So you were supposed to think of one practice that you're working on and note up to 3 norms that protect or sustain this practice. So we asked you to identify what the practice is, what the norms are that sustain it, who the norm affects, whether there's positive or negative sanctions, who the reference group or those who influence someone to follow that norm, and where this takes place. So I'm going to stop for a moment now and ask if anyone would like to share an example that they worked on between the last session and this session.
We could also take volunteers who want to share a practice that they work on in their work, and then we could talk through it together as well.
Okay. I can share mine.
Please, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. I wrote thought about early marriage. And the norms that I pointed out were that girls have got to, there's a norm that girls have got to marry early so that it is within their childbearing age. Otherwise, your marriage will not be successful. The other one is that as one gets older, it's difficult to get a suitable spouse, as well as conceive. The other one that I thought of, most of the young girls grow up thinking that the highest level of respect is when one is in a marriage setting. Otherwise, if you're not married, you're in a broken, you're not staying with a man, then that means you're not respectable. It doesn't matter whether you're married or not. And that virginity is synonymous with non-exposure. You're not cool per se, and that everyone must settle down. Settling down is synonymous with marriage, and definitely you've got to have children. And I thought the function was that it contributes to these early marriages. The subject is the adolescents, young adolescent, both boys and men. The sanctions, when I thought about susceptibility to abuse in relations, and a reference group are the peers, and other adolescents, and it's active in communities across Uganda, the north, the east, the south. That is what I put together.
Thank you, Rose. That's great. So you can see the practice, early child marriage, and a number of norms, the population group, boys and girls, sanctions. I'm wondering, Rose, in some of the norms, you also talked about sanctions. So the fact that, you mentioned abuse in the relationship, but I think also you said it's not cool, they get respect from marrying early. So another sanction could be lack of respect in the community.
Okay.
What other, let's see. The reference group, you talked about peers and adolescents. I'm wondering if others who enforce those norms might be community elders, because I think
cultural leaders.
Cultural leaders, because they're the ones who are probably also enforcing norms by, saying that someone who's not married is not respectful, or someone who is not settled down, and criticizing people, or women in particular who have children out of wedlock, for example. So I think this is great. Anyone, and that I think another interesting thing about this, the norms that you chose, is that they're quite universal across Uganda. Okay, if there's no comments, I think we'll move on, because we do have, we're going to do some more examples in a little different way during our session today. So today we're going to talk really about three areas. We're going to talk about what the value is of norms assessments. We're going to strengthen our understanding of the exercise that we just did, of the extent to which norms influence key behaviors in reference groups. And we're going to just take a little bit of time to reflect on how these norms assessment findings might apply to your programs. So this is sort of an overview of assessing social norms and where we're going to be going today. So, we want to dive a little deeply into this, starting with the value of norms assessments, and review a number of resources and practices that might be helpful to you as you work on your norms. So starting with the assessment to social norms, I want to start out with activity to kind of get to know what your experience is and to start thinking about formative assessments. So what we want to do here is divide into small groups. Meredith is going to divide us into breakout groups. And these are the questions that I'd like you to discuss with your couple other people in your mini breakout groups. We're going to just be in these groups for about 10 minutes. So I'd like you to talk about what assessments have you done in your programs? When have you used these assessments? Have you explored norms in depth? And are there any gaps that you've encountered in your work doing this? Any questions about the assignment or about the activity? So basically, you're just going to chat with each other about what kind of assessments, formative research activities that you've done to help inform your programs. Meredith, are you ready to divide us up into groups?
Yeah, almost. I'm just going to reshuffle slightly. So we'll be ready here in 1 second. And we'll come back, you said, in 10 minutes?
Yeah, I think 10 minutes. And we'll just, you don't have to share formally, but we'll talk a little bit about what you discussed in the group to launch us into the next part of the session. Hi, everybody. Are we all back? Let's see. Good. I see we're coming back. So how did the breakout? Thanks, Paul. How did the breakout rooms go?
Oh, for me, they were fantastic. Very, very revealing, and our members were very, very active. So they identified a number of ways in which they carry out assessments, a lot of focus on rapid gender analysis. And within these rapid gender analysis, they focus on gender norms, on power analysis, power relations. So they have an aspect of gender norms infused in there. And they also do needs assessments as well as baseline studies. And in this, they apply participatory research and action methods. So it was really quite interesting.
Thanks, Paul. Do any of the other groups want to share anything? I see Meredith is calling out Alim for talking about Kara's Snap tool. We'll talk about that a little bit later, and maybe Alim, I can ask you to talk a little bit about it also, so if you can be kind of prepared. I think in our group, I noticed there was a range of methods. As Paul mentioned, we had focus groups, individual interviews, online surveys, stakeholder assessments. And there was a nice comment about how the type of method we use depends on the population, right? Like if we're working on with children, that might be different kinds of methods than if you were working with adults. And also I wanted to note that initially people were kind of, oh, we don't do this. We don't do social norms assessments, just because they were thinking, you know, that there was some special sort of technique to do that. But everyone on in our group did some kind of assessments that were relevant to norms and also learned information about norms. Maybe not quite as focused as we could be. So that's what we'll be talking about a little bit further today, how to make that work a little bit more focused and make sure we're covering the information that we really like to get about norms. So let me just go ahead.
Rebecca, can you address the term formative assessment? Natalie said in her group that was a new term for them, and it may go back to the fact that people are looking at norms, but maybe not using the same ways to describe it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I use the word formative assessment, I'm basically referring to something that you're doing to shape your program activities. So it's something early on or during your program, rather than a summative assessment. So that's typically the two terms we use, formative and summative. So summative is like it sounds, a summation or a sum at the end, of how something went, what did we succeed, what did we, what did the program, what were the results of the program? Well, a formative, just think about it in terms of the word form or formation. It's more about forming or shaping your program by doing certain kind of assessment activities that will help you develop your program or improve your program. Any questions or comments about the breakout? Okay, then I'm going to move forward to do a brief introduction here about what a social norms assessment is. So social norm assessment are activities that you use to determine rapidly whether norms exist. So I say rapidly there because as we were just talking about a formative assessment, this is something that we want to shape our program going forward or our evaluation or our baseline tool. So it's not something, we're not talking now about something that might take a year or longer because we want rapid information to feed into our activities. So, and the next piece of it is that we want to identify which social norms are, whether a norm exists for the behavior that you're thinking about within a given reference group in terms of the behavioral outcome that you have. So basically, we're trying to, increase hand washing. What are the norms that are relevant to hand washing in this particular setting where I'm working, so that that can then inform my design and implementation strategy. So the key here is that we're identifying which norms are most relevant to the behavior outcome we're seeking in our program. And social norms assessment can also help us to design monitoring and evaluation approaches. We have also found we go into a program with maybe our baseline already developed, but after we do the social norms assessment, we realize that we don't have the right norms in the survey, we don't have the right reference groups, we haven't expressed it correctly, we don't know what the sanctions are. So the things that we learn from the norms assessment can help us to fine-tune our monitoring and evaluation activities. Okay, so I was just taking a quick look at the chat box. So in this next slide, talks about the key questions that a social norm assessment can answer that will help us to integrate norm shifting into our program. So the norms assessments provide us information about when and under what conditions social norms affect behavior, whether sanctions influence the behavior, what those sanctions are, and who the relevant reference groups are. So you can see, so these questions on the left are really, most important. That's what you want to learn from your social norms assessment. And on the right tells you what you'll do with that information. So of course, we want to know who are the reference groups. Like as we were discussing just a few minutes ago, we talked about peers, we talked about community elders. Those are the reference groups for child marriage. So that's important because we want to make sure we're including the right people in our programs and in the evaluations. Our second question is, what are the actual norms that influence this behavior? And we also talked about, we saw an example first up on a call of how there can be multiple norms that influence a behavior. So this is important because we want to be kind of clear on what the root causes of an issue are so that our programs can articulate it correctly and address the root causes of behaviors. The third question, why do people comply with norms? Understanding this will help us kind of unpack that black box of program design. Maybe people follow norms because they're, because norms are hidden, because they want to conform, because they gain social benefits, which we discussed in the child marriage example. So it's really helpful to understand why people are complying in order to shift negative norms or support positive norms. And then the last question is perhaps the most difficult and maybe one of the most important. We need to prioritize norms because, as we discussed, there are often many norms influencing a behavior, and it's difficult for a program to address, all of the norms. So I'm just taking a quick look at the chat box. Thanks everyone for your comments. I know internet connection is really difficult, so thank you so much for hanging in there with us. And we'll share the recording and the slides out afterwards. So if you miss pieces of it, you can still go back and refresh them, review them later. So I want to share basically 2 case studies that show the value of these kinds of norms-focused assessments for you to read. So you can just take a look at the screen while I'm chatting. Basically the idea is if you go into your program being very confident that you know what the norms are, you might find that's not true. So it's important it can be helpful for programs to do some kind of assessment to see if their assumptions are correct and better understand the situation before launching into their program. So the example on this screen here talks about girls' education and how it was relying on staff insights of what they felt the norms were that affected girls' enrollment. And through a norms assessment, then the program found out that it wasn't just parents' attitudes or the value of girls, which is what the staff thought. It actually had a lot to do with other kinds of norms around concerns about girls mobilizing in the community, about their purity, how that might be affected if they're out mixing with boys, and social stigma from girls being out in the community where they had to walk, very far to the school that they were attending. So this program, as a result of this, they shifted their focus to only working in school to working more broadly to address community norms and attitudes about girls. I'm just taking one pause here because I see Judith is asking another question. And the slide we had with those 4 questions, she's also saying, who are the key influences or facilitators of specific norms? Definitely, that's a really important question, and we'll explore that a little bit more. So here's another example of the value of assessing norms. This one is about male engagement. So this is showing that norms assessments can be used to help programs understand the context and understand what norms exist and how they work to influence behavior. So in this program, which actually took place in Kinshasa in DRC, what we saw here is that we learned that there were important community leaders, faith leaders, who emerged as influencers of norms. And here the issue really was, it was around family planning, and we found that, and violence, and we found that while faith leaders were important for enforcing norms around violence, it was partners, spouses, who influenced norms around family planning use. So the program was able to fine-tune and adapt its strategies to make sure that it included those reference groups adequately in their program design. So let me stop here. What I'm going to talk about next is how to do the norms assessments. So I want to ask if there's any questions or comments or reflections on the value of norms assessments. Perhaps someone has some experience where they've done a norms assessment and they've learned something that was helpful to their program, or a question that they might have right now with your program where you're not quite sure how norms are influencing and you'd like more information. So any thoughts on experience with assessing norms or with a need for more information from your program?
I have a question.
Please, go ahead.
Okay. I think if I'm not mistaken, you were saying that a specific norm can inform how to develop a main tools. So that's not somehow clear for me. Is it, are you saying that in terms of content or in terms of the measurement methodology? How to measure that specific norm?
Thank you. Yeah, that's an excellent question. So she's asking about monitoring and evaluation and how a norms assessment might help us adapt that, and whether it's content or measurement. So I would say both. So for example, yeah, let me give you an example, the same example I just gave from DRC. So we started the program, you know, we had already submitted to the review board a survey. At the same time, we were doing the social norms exploration. So what we found from the social norms exploration, you know, we already knew that this program was we wanted to address social norms. So we had already included in the survey some questions about the norm, you know, specific norms that we felt were related to violence and family planning. We also had some questions about who enforced those norms, the reference groups, and what the sanctions were. But we learned, so we were already thinking about norms, but we learned that the norms were not phrased correctly. So the way that we had expressed the norms, we were going to ask them questions like, you know, do other people in your community use family planning? You know, do many men in your community beat their wives? I'm just making the right questions. Would you be judged critically if for men, if you're too easy on your wife if she disobeys you? So we had a series of questions that were trying to address injunctive and descriptive norms, but we found that the way they were phrased were not consistent with the way community members were talking about the norms. So we had to change those, and in some cases, just slightly shift the norms that we were working on in the program. The other thing is we didn't have the right influencers. So another program I'm working on, they had focused on their monitoring tools. They had focused on the influence. It was a very young adolescent program. Their tools were going to focus on peers enforcing norms, and they found that it was really the elder siblings and the parents that were the ones who were enforcing norms. So that's an example of we had to shift both the language in the tool because it wasn't quite expressed in the right words, and also who the people were. We said, you know, so it would be like, do other young people or do your friends in the community do blah, 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 you know, and we had to shift it to, do your older siblings expect you to do? So we actually so that's for the baseline survey tool. But we also found that understanding more clearly what are the norms, the priority norms, and who enforces them, and what are the consequences of going against those norms, we were able to build those into our monitoring tools so that as we did focus groups or check-ins throughout the program, we had a better sense of specifically what to check on, rather than the assumptions that we had when we started the program. So both content and measurement, I would say. Comments or questions on that? Let's see, I'm looking in the chat box. Okay, Caroline is asking me about the barriers analysis approach. So barriers analysis, I'm not sure, Caroline, can you explain what your question is about? When you say, is that the barriers analysis approach? What do you mean by do you mean, is that a social norms assessment approach?
Just picking from the different highlights you gave from the different assessments that you have done, I was just wondering if it aligns with the barriers analysis approach. It's one of the formative assessment survey methodologies that looks at the 12 determinants for behavioral change. So there are standard 12 behaviors that you'd look out for, and I seemed to pick out that you were pretty much picking on some of them already. For instance, when you look at positive and negative consequences of a particular behavior, you're looking at the consequences to the behavior. In some communities, you'd probably want to look at their inclination to divinity, whether it affects a particular behavior, and eventually it relates into the social norms. I just wanted to understand whether the particular survey approach you were referencing to was the barriers analysis approach to formative studies?
Yeah, that's a great question, Caroline. So, I actually hadn't given that as an example of a social norms assessment barrier analysis, but I think you're spot on. I think it would be a good approach. So you can all, if you're interested, you can kind of Google barrier analysis, and there's a very good manual on how to do it. And you're basically looking at what are those barriers. You're comparing people who are doing a behavior with those who are not doing behavior. And as Caroline said, you're looking at those barriers to it by comparing and contrasting. And it's a really nice approach because it's pretty simple. It's kind of direct, concrete, and it also looks at a number of barriers, and I think it does a good job of pulling out social norms. So I think that's a great contribution, Margaret, that I hadn't actually thought of before. But I think maybe I'd have to go back, maybe a little bit of tweaking, but I think a barrier analysis is a good way of looking at social norms, assessing social norms. Any other comments on questions or comments about norms assessment and their potential value?
I think, well, that was Caroline from the last question, but Margaret just made a comment that she's looking forward to learning more about the approaches and the methods for assessing norms and prioritizing the influencers.
Thank you, Margaret. That comment, I was not ignoring it, but that's the next thing we're going to talk about. So let me move to the next section, which is we're going to talk about, how to do norms assessment and exploring some existing resources, which we've done a little bit already, talking about barrier analysis, and also present one approach to do so. So I think that was a great comment, Margaret, and just seeing. Okay, we can share, when we send out the notes, we can share a link to a manual for barrier analysis. If anyone wants to chat it into the chat box now, but I would take me a little bit to find it. So, all right, so we're going to talk about some existing resources. So all of you have, many of you, if not all of you, have already done some kind of formative assessments, right? So you already have quite a lot of experience, and I see you also have experience doing participatory approaches, which is what we're going to talk about today. So, often norms assessment is qualitative exercises, including vignettes and analysis, but it can also be done with quantitative surveys or, assessment of literature data that already exists. So, but given that, we do know that qualitative methodologies are the most typical and typically quite fruitful for this kind of work. And there are a number of collaboratives and organizations that are thinking through this critical step of social norms analysis. So some of those are developed by the Global Learning Collaborative to Advance Normative Change. That's the social norms exploration tool that I'll share with you today. We have the SNAP, which is developed by CARE and used quite widely. And a lot of the key elements of SNAP were included in the social norms exploration tool, and CARE also provided some input into that tool. UNICEF has an interesting approach. The Overseas Development Institute does, and Pin Sung at the University of Pennsylvania also has some guidance and manuals. So, those are all really good resources that you can look to do social norms approaches. And I thought maybe this might be a good time. Alim, can I put you on the spot here to talk a little bit about SNAP?
Okay, thank you. I have also a colleague from CARE. Addis, do you think you can introduce yourself and you can also say something about it? I didn't want to talk.
However, that would be great.
Yeah.
Hi, Alam. Yeah, I think I introduced myself, but I think I would just ask everyone the host maybe to revise the questions in a more clearer way. But I can go again. This is Addis from Ethiopia, and my role is Social Accountability and Gender Advisor. I was in the last breakout room, and we were talking about how we used SNAP analysis and the gaps that we have been facing in our SRHR projects.
Thank you, Addis. I just thought maybe for the whole group, you could tell them a little bit about what SNAP is.
Yeah, so SNAP is one assessment tool that we use. Actually, we use both SNAP and SAA, Social Analysis and Action Tools, but SNAP goes as Social Analysis, Social Norms Analysis Plot. We have excellent tools in SNAP called, for example, Vignette. So now usually when we use Vignette, because social norms are usually taboo topics, but it depends from region to region, right? So one region, SRHR issues are taboo topics, and the other, for example, harmful traditional practices are taboo topics. So what we do is we give some kind of persona or questions in the SNAP tool, and then we observe the community's reaction to those specific questions. And the reactions that we somehow take during the assessment is, which actions are very sanctioned by the community, which actions are rewarded by the community, and which are not very appreciated, which actions or perceptions have consequences of when it comes to, they have their own consequence. For example, in the gender box, women stepping outside of the box have this kind of sanction, should be facing this kind of things, should be given name callings, and so on and so on. So because we don't want to do any harm, and also inform our project activities based on the cultural expectation, and also how we can push them out of that perception, we use Vignette. So SNAP is a broader term. It's a collective of different tools. One strong part about SNAP is, like I said, it creates a very comfortable, scenario when you integrate with the community. Because like I said, these issues are usually taboo and not very appreciative. And the other way is we use SNAP and then we somehow manage the group during the reflection by using these tools. Meaning, for example, we make sure the groups are homogeneous, because adolescent girls don't reflect openly when their elderlies are around, mainly their mother-in-laws. And also generally women don't reflect openly when their husbands or other relative men are around. So we use homogeneous groups and use these tools to reflect on the issues. Same as the SAA social analysis and action tool as well. SAA, we have the gender box, we have root cause analysis such as but why, we have value clarification tool. So all these tools ensure that we create that safe space for community to reflect on these social norms, but at the same time help us observe the frequency and the level of severity of the practices.
That's really great. Thanks, Addis. That's a great introduction to social action analysis and SNAP. And maybe if you and LM could, so if you all go to CARE's website, there's a wealth of information about some of these practices and also their work on social norms. So if you want to, if you can chat the link in the box, I think that would be helpful for people. And we can also send it out in the notes, send out the link in the notes afterwards. So let me move on now, and we might have time to come back and discuss this a little bit more. So I want to talk just for a second about some of the options for assessing norms that have already come up on the call. So first we have secondary data collection, which basically is just reviewing the literature and data that you already have. So this is a logical first step. And it's really helpful if you don't have resources to collect data of your own. It's always a good place to start, and it can also be a good option if that's all of the resources that you have. You're looking into studies in the specific context where you're working with the same outcomes to learn what you can about what the norms and the reference groups and the sanctions are. It's always great to try to contact people who did that work and talk to them, one-on-one to get their insights. Then in terms of actually going out and collecting data, there's, a number of different approaches that we've discussed. So Addis was just talking about vignettes, which are, you know, qualitative open-ended stories, although you can also use them quantitatively. And they provide contextually driven information about how participants react in a certain situation. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on the call. Those are best done if you have a little bit of information so that you can shape the vignette appropriately. You can always do, and some of you all already mentioned doing this, individual interviews or focus group discussions. So that may be adding new questions to it or tweaking the guides that you already have. And then finally, I think Grace maybe was bringing this up in the chat box about, you know, are these participatory activities? So a lot of the most exciting norms exploration approaches, are about engaging people, you know, using participatory approaches because, you know, as we all have discussed already quite a bit, a lot of times people are not really aware of the norms around them. You know, I like to think about it as a fish in a bowl of water. They're not really aware of the water around them. So it's helpful to have engaging activities that help people to see what norms are, you know, rather than just directly asking them. Okay, so let me move on to the next slide here. So this slide is about participatory methods. So a couple of you have mentioned in my breakout group and also already in the plenary about participatory approaches. So I'm wondering if any of you want to talk about using those or your experience using those for exploring social norms. I've got the chat open. Grace, I know you asked about participatory approaches. Do you want to share a little bit about what's in your mind, why you asked about that?
Yeah. Let me get my.
There you go.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, I'm back. What I meant because if they are participatory, because participatory methods are definitely good and actually position the respondents in a much more maybe comfortable and powerful, and realize that they're actually very important. But at the same time, sometimes they can also sort of revoke the feelings of uneasiness and sometimes feeling that what they did was wrong. We were starting a program regarding child marriage and in eastern Uganda, and the girls, you know, were at some point they would feel uncomfortable, and then most of the information came out when we were one-on-one, but when they were like a group of 3 or 4, you know, trying to get the broader picture, we found that the one-on-one and maybe allowing them to grow and ask them a question, they were able to say more than what they were saying in the group. I guess maybe they were comfortable. So the question is, how do you make the people who are being affected by this situation to really engage and don't feel like they have been victims and maybe they are even powerless to move out of this situation?
That's great. Yeah. Thank you, Grace. Really helpful comments. So I think the idea about participatory methods is that they do have some advantages to more structured approaches, especially in early days when you're doing the early research. They offer a direct but less biased means for you to learn about social norms. They're very well suited to the complexity of social norms. They can be very fun for participants, and they can allow greater ownership of the research the research process by participants. So that's something we always are seeking to do in social norms work, to really work with the community and engage the community from the beginning. And participatory methods, of course, is a way to do that. that really values and elevates the voice of the communities or the folks that we're working with. There's a little chat, some chat going on about whether SNAP, or in what way SNAP is, and the tools that Edis was sharing are participatory. So she's saying here, yes, they are participatory. They guide the facilitator to make sure the reflections are carried out. So one of the challenges sometimes of these kind of methods is that they can be, facilitation is important, but also sort of doing them quickly and pulling out the key results and applying them can sometimes be complicated or overwhelming for people. So both the SNAP and the SNET are approaches to make it a little simpler, like a step-by-step process with specific actions to apply them to your work. So I think that's the benefit of some of these structured methods that people have been developing and using. So I'm going to stop talking now for a moment, and I'm going to try to share a video with you. So the approach that that I'd like to share with you today, in addition to what we've learned about the SNAP so far, is the social norms exploration tool. So this is about a 5-minute video that I hope I'll be able to show, and you can learn a little bit more about it and hear about the experiences of people who have used it. I think in the meantime, we'll put a link to the SNET, we call it the SNET, Social Norms Exploration Tool, in the chat box so that you can look at it later. Okay, so I think we're... Can you hear me? Hear it?
No,
Okay.
I can't see anything. Is it me or?
Not yet, Rebecca. We can't see it either.
Okay, hold on one second. So let me go here.
Um,
Oh, I know
let me
why.
know.
Because
Okay.
it's because I joined and rejoined, right? I think.
Okay, let me know if you
Norms
want
matter.
me.
How about this?
We
As
can hear it,
unwritten
but we
rules of
can't see
behavior
it.
shared by members of a given
Ah,
group or society,
okay.
social
Why is
norms
that?
influence the
Try?
behaviors and
Yeah, sure.
practices of
Go ahead.
communities everywhere. For programs that
It has gone off. Is it me or?
Yeah, we're Meredith's going to share it because I wasn't successfully sharing.
social norms matter. As
Can you
unwritten
hear
rules
it?
of behavior shared by members of a
Yes.
given group or
I can
society,
hear.
social norms influence
And
the
you can
behaviors
see
and
it?
practices of
Yeah, and we
communities.
can see it. Thanks.
For programs that want to change existing harmful behaviors or form positive new ones, social norms can be an important part of program design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. But how do you identify the social norms affecting your programs? Recognize who or what influences those norms and use that information to make your programs more impactful. The Social Norms Exploration Tool, or SNET, provides guidance, exercises, and tips so your team can quickly understand social norms, work with community members to discover what norms influence their behavior or actions, and use your findings to develop more effective programs in the communities where you work. Developed for program implementers, the SNET will help you answer 4 key questions. Who is most influential to your program's participants when it comes to practicing or not practicing a specific behavior? What are the social norms that influence this behavior? Why do participants comply with or reject these norms? And what norms have the most influence on these behaviors? Together, we'll look at 5 simple phases for rapid and participatory social norms diagnosis. Let's get started. Phase 1 is all about planning and preparing. Each activity helps prepare you to explore norms in your community. You'll start by reflecting on the root causes of your target behaviors and developing an understanding of the norms that affect your program. Next, you'll decide whether you need to segment your program's participants based on factors like age, sex, or social status. After that, you'll develop the objectives of your social norms exploration and choose the exercises to use in communities. Now is also when you determine the number of communities and participants to engage. And finally, you'll develop a plan that guides the preparations and logistics of working in your program community. You'll come back to phase 1 throughout your exploration as a reminder of your goals and objectives. In the second phase, your team will interview community members to identify the reference groups. Because social norms are context-specific, reference groups are the power holders and influential people that sustain community beliefs affecting social norms. You'll start by asking your program's participants questions about who gives them advice and influences the way they behave. Next, you'll quickly analyze the responses and decide which reference groups are most trusted in your community. Knowing who your reference groups are will help you make sure you're including the right people in your programs. In phase 3, you'll work side by side with local stakeholders to explore which social norms and other factors influence their behavior. You'll use a participatory exercise to conduct group discussions with your program's participants and your reference groups.
The social norms exploration tool helped us to gather information and insights on family planning and reproductive health from our community audiences using participatory designed approaches which were more engaging and interactive for our participants.
Talking with your program's participants and their reference groups allows you to tailor your program's social and behavior change strategies. In phase 4, it's time to analyze and interpret all your information to identify the social norms that influence behaviors and their importance for your program. Together, your team will rapidly analyze the information you collected to identify the norms that influence target behaviors, the weight of their influence, and the consequences of conforming to or violating them. Understanding the social norms at play in your program communities will help you develop the right strategies. In the final phase, you're ready to apply what you've learned to your program activities.
The SNET, because of how simple and straightforward it is, it has allowed us to build the capacity of of the REACH project staff in understanding research protocols and understanding some of those easy ways that you can get information and data around your project.
Your team will use your newly gained knowledge on social norms to design or adjust your program. Your team can use the SNET's sample program matrix or list of guiding questions to plan how you can apply what you've learned to your program design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. Programs around the world have already used this SNET to better understand and address the behaviors and practices influencing their community-based programs.
We thank SNET activity which enabled our project to understand the key barriers for family planning uptake, which are emerging from deep-rooted social norms and reference groups who pose barrier to uptake of family planning. This has informed us and we were able to review, refine, and contextualize.
You can use this SNET anytime in your program lifecycle, making it a valuable resource for shifting social norms.
We are hoping that when you also try the use of SNET, you will be able to improve your programs and share your learnings as well.
Download and share the SNET today.
Thanks, Meredith. So let me share my screen again, and let's just take a second to see if anyone has any questions or comments or observations.
Rebecca, thank you. I wanted to ask a question.
Please.
How do you identify the influencers that people may not be conscious about, like, media, things they're exposed to in the environment that really drive their behaviors, but they may be in the subconscious?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So the methodology in the SNET is more focused on people around them that we can go talk with. So they use a technique called rapid interviewing, where we do like rapid fire interviews with a series of questions that you would develop about, who do you go to when you're worried about this, or who gives you advice about this, or who do you trust about this. So it's not so, that part of the SNET activity is not so well, I think, suited for identifying things like celebrities or other reference groups that aren't live people in someone's sphere. I think those can come out of some of the other participatory activities, like the vignettes, etc., that the exercises of the 5 whys that people use. So I think that's a really interesting and important kind of point there. It's not, reference groups are not only those people that we can identify in our lives. But maybe hold that question. Yeah, actually, I think you would want to look through the exercises in the SNET and in other social norms exploration techniques and think about, to make sure we're addressing that question adequately. Other questions or comments? Okay, so I'm going to move on to our next activity, I hope, which is going to be a breakout. So what we're going to do now is we're going to break out into 2 breakout sessions, and we're going to do one of the activities from the SNET. It's also an activity that many of you have probably done in other kinds of data collection activities. So, but we're going to do it focused on this case study. So this case study comes from a program that some of you may be aware of or familiar with, the Husbands Clubs from Niger, École de Marie. It's also being expanded into a few other countries. So this case study, it's basically the program brings together husbands and talks to them about maternal and child health and family planning, and then they become educators, teachers, emissaries to go out and talk to other husbands, their wives, and others in the community. So this program is based on the understanding that the power of men and their behavior represents a big obstacle to women's use of reproductive health services in those contexts. It also is built on understanding that this common practice of confining women in their homes is one of the challenges, because women are supposed to stay home, isolated, and not go and access services. So in these settings, there is very late seeking of health services or reduced seeking of services because of men's behaviors. Husbands are often opposed to women using these health services, and women are not consulted on decisions about the spacing and timing of their pregnancies. So that's the case study we're going to use in the next exercise. So what we're going to do is go into these 2 breakouts, and we're going to use an online kind of exercise to select a behavior related to the case study. So for example, delaying care during pregnancy could be an example of a behavior. We're going to write that on the trunk of the tree. Then we're going to brainstorm for a few minutes about the consequences of this behavior. Then we're going to go to under the tree, and we're going to list all of the factors, not just norms, but all the factors that might influence that behavior. So you might have lack of resources, poor education, gender norms. We'll have all of the roots of the problem that we'll brainstorm. And then we're going to circle which of those root causes are norms related. When you actually do this process, you might dive deeper, and this could take a couple of hours. Today, of course, we're just going to do it quickly just to get the experience of it. Then we're going to also talk about the benefits of following the norm, the consequences of not following the norm, or what we would call positive and negative sanctions, and what are the reference groups that keep these norms in place. So we're going to just kind of walk through this activity. This is an activity that you can do with your staff to better understand norms. You can do it in the community. You can do it in a focus group, in an individual interview. There's a lot of different ways to use this activity. But right now, we're going to do it together. Are there any questions about this activity? Okay, so we're going to move into, oops, not that. We're going to move, and then, sorry, and then we're going to come back and we're going to share what the two groups did. And I think we're going to spend, I'm looking at the clock, 10, 20, yeah, I think we can spend about a half an hour in our breakout groups before we come back, because we'll come back, or maybe, yeah, 25 minutes. We'll come back and we'll share some reflections from your groups, and we'll just do a few wrap-up slides. Okay, over to you, Meredith.
Okay, great. So I just set the timer at 25 minutes. And if you get kicked out of your breakout room and you come back, you can join back into the room. Rebecca, you're going to be in room 1 and I will be in room 2. And we'll get started now.
Thanks, Meredith.
Meredith, do you want to start off by sharing your Jamboard?
Sure. Okay, so we could have kept going. We tried to make sure we got a little bit of everything on here. Okay, so we had a lot of great participation in our group. I know that nobody likes to be put on the spot, but if anyone from our group that would like to share and kind of walk people through the behavior, the outcomes, the causes, and the reference groups and sanctions that we went through, that would be wonderful. We had, let's see, we had Grace, we had our colleague from Madifa, we had Sam, we had Rose, we had Margaret, we had Addis. Any volunteers? And we can trade off if you want to just go through one element.
Sorry, Meredith, it was breaking. You were asking us to present?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, anyone from our group, or Addis, if you want to get us started sharing kind of the things that we talked through.
Sure, definitely, yeah. Yeah, so we picked the behavior, men not taking on unpaid child care or work. And so we started by listing out the consequences or outcomes, as you can see. So men not being engaged in the household, not giving the child care work. Usually the consequences, men can enjoy leisure time, make connection with others, can negatively impact wives too much because they will not be having their own leisure times and also not being able to focus on their personal development. And also, of course, children will end up growing up without knowing or understanding their father, the role of their father in terms of closeness, love, and, in having enough protection around the house. And also another consequence is women's mobility is affected. So they have to stay and care for their children. They will have limited access to information. And definitely women are overloaded with household works. And of course, their health is affected negatively because they work really hard and not take enough time for themselves. Women are unable to take up paid work because they have to stay around the house and do a child care, which is intensive 24/7. So that would somehow pull them back from engaging actively economically. That would also result in them being economically dependent on the man. And also women will not be able to participate in the labor force in a very expected way. So the root cause, of course, the first one is generally social acceptance of the norms and attitudes by all parts of the community. We usually think that women don't want these behaviors. Women encouragement to stay home and then provide child care. But the thing about social norm is even women themselves might be the ones perpetrating these opinions and attitudes because they have been grown up and raised in those cultures and expectations. So we have to work with women and men at the same time in the entire community members. Another root cause is women are, usually believe that they are better at things when it comes to household management, raising children, feeding children, cooking the house, and so on. And also, when the mothers are raised, mothers raise boys and girls differently. So those boys and girls become husbands and wives that are the result of the reflection of their cultures. The community's expectation on women's role is childbearing and managing the family. So that results in men not taking up this responsibility with pride, of course. In the culture definition of what men should do and what women should do is the biggest factor here. Men are not known to stay around the house, to stay around and help the kids, cook, and so on and so on. So those are categorized as women's responsibility. And the type of jobs women do around the house, women are not employed outside the home. So the root causes mainly are because men are sent off to, boys are sent to school, women are sent to marriage, and that results in women not having enough education and network. So that will also make them stay at home. So if they're the ones staying in the house, then they'll most likely be the ones taking care of the children in most cases. And of course, being a mother is usually considered as a natural role. So just because she's a woman, she's a mother already. So everybody expects her to take care of the children, and men start to think that it's not their role, it's not a naturally given component for them to care for the children. So they prefer the kids to go to their mothers. And another root cause is education. The education of the man and woman. Men are usually more educated, more likely to be employed outside of the house. Like I said, and women are usually staying in the house. So even when at times of crisis, we see women leaving their job, even if it's paying less, because their money is even way too low than the man. They prefer them to stay in the house and manage the kids. So sanctions and rewards. Any man stepping outside of this box, or who prefers to stay in the house and take care of his children, would face a lot of ridicule from their peers. His own friends will start calling him a man, a name. They would say that she's the man, she's the wife, she's the husband, you're the wife, etc., and so on like that. So there comes exclusion from groups of men, or he would automatically become unmanly. So he will not be invited to the groups, having fun, and the manly gather-ups, and so on and so on. And another interesting finding is even his own mother will tell him that he's not being a man. So it kind of circles around, the community around him. And so another sanction is he will be rejected from their peers, other men, for not complying, doing something that is not manly, and so on and so on. And we have three main reference groups here: male or peers, friends, mothers, mother-in-laws, of course, and women themselves. In this case, of course, wives, but also, the husband's sisters, all the women around will be contributing to these perceptions.
Thanks, Elam and Meredith. That was a great presentation. I am sadly, because of time, I know we probably could have a rich discussion about that, and we could also share our other screen, but I need to move on. So let me just mention, trying to find my screen here. I just wanted to mention that my group talked about family planning, and we also had a really great discussion on it. So
I can see yours if you wanted me to just flash it on the screen.
I think, okay, sure.
Actually, I'll put it in the chat box and people can click on it, and then we can go on.
Because we only have 5 more minutes, so I think we need to move on, but we will we'll also share it in the notes so that you can all take a look at it, because it's interesting because it's such a different behavior. but you still see a lot of similarities between the two. So, you can see the kind of questions that Alim just went over. But the reason I want to get to the next slide is I want to talk a little bit about how to apply those findings, because we get all of this really rich information, but it's really important to put it back into our programs. So this slide is showing you some of the questions that the SNET uses in order to keep a focus on your analysis. So you start thinking about what is your program trying to achieve? What are the key findings from the norms assessment, such as what we just did in other activities, and what are the adjustments that can be made based on those findings? So the SNET and other approaches, like the SNET in particular, has kind of a program matrix that you use to then ask a question and fill out what the implications are of this information to help you apply it to your program. And this slide here also shows you some of the questions that you can consider when adjusting your program with the results of your norms assessment. So the questions that are key here are on the, we've divided it here by program design, program implementation, program monitoring, and program evaluation. So under some of the key questions are bolded. So you can see under program design, are you addressing the key factors that are influencing the behavior you're trying to address? Does your intervention strategy need some kind of adaptation to better address reference groups? This is often something we see, that not all of the reference groups or not the right reference group is addressed. Does our logical framework, program kind of theory of change need to be adjusted to more explicitly address social norms throughout the inputs, outputs, and effects? And do we need to make any changes in our evaluation framework to reflect all of those changes that we've made? So you can see, there's more detailed questions and we'll share those out, but these are all ways to help your team, once you have the results of your social norms reflection, to apply it and put it into action. Thanks, Meredith, just sharing our Jamboard. Thanks a lot. And I'm going to go into some final reflections. So some of the key takeaways is that some of the formative assessments you're doing may overlook norms. So if you're really interested in norms in your program, it's important to really explicitly make sure you're addressing those questions that we looked at today. So what are the norms? What are the reference groups? What are the sanctions? And how do you prioritize which ones to address in your program? It's important to understand the pathways or the mechanisms by which norms influence behaviors. And the norms assessments can give us whatever kind, whether it's, barrier analysis or SNAP or SNET or others, they will give us information for your particular context of what norms are relevant, who the reference groups are, why people comply with norms, and which norms are most important. So that's really what we're looking for in whatever kind of norms assessment you do. And, there's no perfect way to do this. It's better to have some information than none. So lots of times people say, oh, I don't have funds for this. I don't, that's fine. Just do what you can with the resources you have available, but make sure that you're using those findings to guide your program implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So, and as we mentioned, there's a number of resources out there for you to use. So this can kind of facilitate your work doing this. I can see Meredith's slide is sharing the slides. So maybe in our next, let's talk about what's coming. I know here's a set of resources where you can find out more about norms assessment approaches. And this is what's coming next. So our next session is identifying strategies for norm change. So I know we're really rushing this. Maybe we can start out our next session with a little bit of reflection on norms assessments, what we've learned, what the issues are, questions you have, maybe thoughts of how easy or difficult it is to apply these things. So our next session in March is going to be Ben is going to lead us into really exciting content around how to use change norms. So what kind of strategies should we use in the program? So building on understanding norms from session 1, identifying social norms from this session, we'll move into identifying strategies for change. And then our last session will be on monitoring and evaluation. Just checking. Okay, so that is what we have on tap for you. And then you can see what our next session will focus on. So theories of change, key questions for strategy development, 4 norms change strategies, and how to pick the right strategies. So I'm sorry I'm rushing through this, but I know people have other calls and places to be. So I wanted to make sure everyone saw what's coming up next. Any questions or comments before we close for the day?
Maybe Rebecca, if I can just say very quickly, it would be very helpful if participants could come to the next session with a copy of, if they have it, with a copy of their theory of change of one of their projects.
That's great, Ben. And we can remind you all of that too when we send out the reminders for the meeting.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for your participation. That was really fun to work with you on the Jamboard, and have a great couple of weeks, and we'll see you again soon.